I remember the day we received the orders to hold our position like it was yesterday. Lieutenant Aaron's voice was firm and confident as he relayed the message from command. We were to dig in and prepare to defend our ground against the enemy's advance. The promise of imminent relief was like a spark of electricity that ran through our squad. We were a team, a family, and we had each other's backs. There was Jenkins, our resident loudmouth, always cracking jokes and keeping our spirits high. Then there was Rodriguez, our medic, who had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when you were hurt. And of course, there was me, just a regular grunt trying to do my part. We had been pushed to the limit for weeks, fighting a war that seemed to have no end. But with the promise of relief, we felt like we could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. We set to work, digging trenches and setting up our defenses. The sun beat down on us, relentless in its ferocity, but we worked tirelessly, fueled by the knowledge that help was on the way. Our squad was a well-oiled machine, each of us knowing our role and playing it to perfection. We were a team, and together we were unstoppable. As we worked, Lieutenant Aaron walked among us, offering words of encouragement and checking on our progress. He was a good leader, fair and firm, and we respected him for it. We knew that he would do everything in his power to get us out of this situation alive. The lieutenant's words of reassurance were like a balm to our weary souls. We were tired, hungry, and thirsty, but we pushed on, driven by the promise of relief. The hours ticked by, and our defenses began to take shape. We had set up a perimeter with gun emplacements and trenches, and we were as ready as we would ever be. The enemy was out there waiting for us, but we were confident in our abilities. We had been in tougher spots before, and we had always come out on top. The promise of relief had given us a newfound sense of purpose, and we were determined to hold our ground. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, we settled in for the night. We knew that the enemy would come for us, but we were ready. We had our gear, our training, and each other. What more could we need? The lieutenant called us together, his voice low and serious. Men, we've been told that relief is on the way. We just have to hold out for a few more hours. He paused, looking around at us. We can do this. We just have to stick together and watch each other's backs. We nodded, our faces set with determination. We were in this together, and we would see it through to the end. The night was long and dark, punctuated by the occasional burst of gunfire and the distant rumble of artillery. We huddled together, trying to get some rest, but our minds were always on the enemy. We knew that they would come for us, and we had to be ready. The promise of relief was still fresh in our minds, and we clung to it like a lifeline. We would hold out no matter what. We would make it through this, together. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, we stirred, our bodies stiff and sore. We knew that today would be the day. The enemy would come for us, and we would have to be ready. We checked our gear, our ammunition, and our defenses. We were as prepared as we would ever be. The promise of relief still echoed in our minds, a beacon of hope in the darkness. We would hold out no matter what. We would make it through this together. And then, just as we were finishing up our preparations, the lieutenant's voice came over the comms system, his tone calm and steady. Men, this is command. Relief is on its way. Just hold out for a few more hours. We looked at each other, our faces set with determination. We would do it. We would hold out, and we would make it through this together. Little did we know, those would be the last words of reassurance we would hear for a long time. The silence that followed the lieutenant's words was palpable, a collective breath held in anticipation of the impending relief. We busied ourselves with final preparations, checking and rechecking our gear, our movements economical and practiced. Jenkins, our squad's de facto comedian, cracked a joke about the lieutenant's timing, saying he must have had a direct line to the heavens to arrange our salvation so swiftly. The laughter that followed was genuine, a release of tension that had been building for what felt like an eternity. I remember thinking, in that moment, that we would make it out of this place, that we would emerge from this bloody quagmire with our heads held high. The promise of relief still echoed in our minds, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As we settled into our positions, the stillness was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional distant rumble of artillery or the staccato burst of small arms fire. It was a reminder that, despite our impending rescue, the war was far from over. The sun beat down on us, relentless in its ferocity, draining the life from our parched skin. I glanced over at Rodriguez, his eyes narrowed against the glare, his face set in a determined grimace. He was a good kid, barely out of his teens, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of responsibility for him, for all of them. We were a squad, a family, and we would see this through together. The wait was interminable, the minutes ticking by with all the speed of a glacier. We knew the enemy was out there, waiting for us, watching us. The tension was almost palpable, a living, breathing thing that wrapped itself around our hearts and squeezed. And then, without warning, the world erupted into chaos. The first shot rang out, a loud, sharp crack that sent us all scrambling for cover. I hit the dirt, my heart racing as the sound of gunfire intensified. The enemy had found us, and they were not happy. The next few minutes were a blur of noise and confusion, our training taking over as we returned fire. I remember seeing Jenkins, his face set in a fierce snarl, laying down a withering field of fire that cut down anyone foolish enough to venture into his sights. Rodriguez was beside me, his eyes wide with fear, but he was firing steadily, his aim true. I was proud of him, proud of all of them. We were a team, a well-oiled machine, and we would not be broken. The initial onslaught was fierce, but we held our ground. We had to. The thought of those reinforcements, of rescue, kept us going. We would hold out, no matter what. The enemy would not take us without a fight. I saw one of them, a burly man with a cruel grin, take a bullet to the chest. He fell, his body twitching, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt. But it was war, and in war there was no room for sentiment. You killed, or you were killed. It was that simple. As the firefight began to die down, we took stock of our losses. We had lost 2 men, brothers, both of them good soldiers. Their bodies lay still, their eyes frozen in a permanent stare. It was a sobering reminder of the reality of our situation. We were not invincible. We could be killed. But even in the face of such tragedy, our morale remained high. We had taken a blow, but we were still standing. We would continue to hold out, to wait for those reinforcements. The promise of relief still lingered, a beacon of hope in the darkness, and we would cling to it no matter what. For now it was all we had. The hours ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as we waited for the promised relief to arrive. We had been told it would be here within 6 hours, that we just had to hold on and help would come. But as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the desolate landscape, we started to feel a nagging sense of unease. Where were they? Why hadn't they arrived yet? We tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on the task at hand, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. Sergeant Jenkins, our squad leader, called us together to discuss our situation. "Listen up, guys," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to start rationing our ammo and water. We don't know how much longer we'll be here, and we can't afford to waste anything." We nodded, understanding the necessity of it. But it was a harsh reminder that our supplies were limited. We had been so sure that help would arrive by now that we wouldn't have to worry about running out of anything. But as the hours dragged on, it was becoming increasingly clear that we were on our own. We began to parcel out our ammo, making sure each man had enough to last for a while, but not so much that we would be left vulnerable if we were attacked again. It was a delicate balance, one that we didn't want to get wrong. Water was also a concern, and we were forced to limit our intake, making sure we had enough to last for at least a few more days. It was a bleak prospect, but we knew we had to be practical. We couldn't afford to get caught out, not now, not when we were so close to, what? Rescue? Relief? We didn't even know anymore. As the night wore on, our optimism started to wane. We had been so sure that help would arrive, that we would be saved. But, as the darkness closed in around us, we began to realize that we might be on our own for a lot longer than we had anticipated. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional burst of gunfire in the distance. It was a reminder that we were not alone, that there were still enemies out there, waiting to pounce. We huddled together, our eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for any sign of movement. I thought back to the brothers we had lost, their bodies still lying where they had fallen. It was a harsh reminder of the reality of our situation, of the price we might have to pay for our stubborn refusal to give up. But even in the face of such tragedy, we had found a way to keep going, to keep hoping. And now, as the night wore on, we were forced to confront the possibility that our hope might be misplaced, that we might be truly alone, with no one coming to save us. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I glanced over at the others, wondering if they were thinking the same thing. Their faces were set, determined, but I could see the doubt lurking in their eyes. We were all thinking it, wondering if we had been abandoned, left to fend for ourselves in this God-forsaken place. But we didn't dare say it out loud, not yet. We had to hold on to hope, no matter how fragile it seemed. It was all we had left. The Vox signal crackled to life, shrill and insistent, cutting through the oppressive silence like a scream. We all turned, our eyes locking onto the comms device as if it held the key to our salvation. Sergeant Jenkins, our squad leader, stepped forward, his voice low and even as he responded to the hail. "This is Squad 7, awaiting relief." Over. The pause that followed seemed to stretch on forever, each tick of the clock echoing through my mind like a death knell. Then the voice on the other end, distant and detached, spoke the words that would change everything. "Squad 7, this is command. Relief column has been delayed. Expected arrival time is now 0600 hours. Hold position and maintain vigilance." Over. The words hung in the air, a cold wind that seeped into our bones and chilled us to the marrow. 0600 hours. Morning. It seemed like an eternity away, a distant horizon that we might never reach. I glanced over at the others, seeing the doubt that had been lurking in their eyes now spread like a stain. We had been told relief was imminent, that help was just hours away. Now it seemed that was no longer the case. The thought sent a whispered question through my mind. What if no one is coming for us? What if we're truly alone out here? I pushed the thought away, refusing to give it voice, but it lingered, a shadow in the corner of my mind. Sergeant Jenkins' face was set, his jaw clenched in a fierce determination. All right, squad. We hold here. We've got this far. We can make it a few more hours. His words were meant to reassure, but they fell flat, punctured by the deflating knowledge that our hope had just been pushed back, delayed like a promise that might never be kept. We nodded, our movements mechanical, as we began to settle in for the long, dark night ahead. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness, each one a countdown to a dawn that might bring salvation or destruction. We huddled together, our eyes scanning the darkness, our ears straining to pick up any sound that might signal the approach of our enemy. The silence was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down upon us, making it hard to breathe. And through it all, the doubts crept in, seeping into our minds like a chill, whispering that we might be truly alone, that no one was coming to save us. I thought of our squad, of the men I had come to consider brothers. There was Marcus, our sniper, his eyes always scanning the horizon for the next target. Rachel, our medic, her hands always ready to heal the wounds we suffered. And Jenkins, our sergeant, his leadership the only thing that kept us going. We were a team, a unit, and together we had faced down impossible odds. But now, as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were facing our greatest challenge yet, the challenge of holding on to hope when all seemed lost. The darkness outside seemed to press in around us, a living, breathing entity that sought to consume us. We were a small, fragile island in a sea of chaos, and the thought of being abandoned, of being left to the mercy of the enemy, was a constant, gnawing fear. But we couldn't give in to it, not yet. We had to hold on, had to keep believing that help would come, that we would be rescued. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. As the night dragged on, the silence between us grew, a palpable thing that seemed to thicken the air. We didn't talk, didn't dare to, lest we give voice to the doubts that plagued us. Instead, we sat, our eyes fixed on the darkness, our minds racing with thoughts of what might be, of what could be. The Vox signal had brought us a message, a promise of relief delayed, but it had also brought us something else, a creeping sense of uncertainty, a feeling that our fate was no longer in our own hands. And that was a thought that was almost too much to bear. The darkness seemed to press in around us, a physical presence that weighed upon our shoulders. I glanced around at the others, their faces lit only by the faint moonlight that filtered through the clouds. Jenkins' eyes were narrowed, his jaw set in a tight line, while Rodriguez's gaze was vacant, his mind 1,000 miles away. I knew that look, had seen it before in the mirror. It was the look of a man who was trying to come to terms with the unthinkable, with the possibility that we might not make it out of this place alive. Vargas, our de facto leader, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting back and forth between us. He knew, as we all did, that the situation was dire. The Vox signal had promised relief, but it had also hinted at delays, at complications. And we knew that in a war like this, complications could be fatal. I thought back to the words of the Vox operator, his voice calm and detached, but laced with a hint of uncertainty. Relief is on the way, but it's going to be a while. You're going to have to hold on for a bit longer, guys. A bit longer. How long was a bit longer? Hours? Days? Weeks? The silence between us grew until it was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. We had been abandoned, left to fend for ourselves in a hostile land. The war machine had chewed us up and spat us out, and now we were nothing more than a mere afterthought. I looked around at the others, at the dwindling group of men who had become my family. We had been a team, a cohesive unit, But now we were just a handful of scared, tired, and hungry soldiers clinging to each other in the face of overwhelming odds. Jenkins spoke up, his voice low and rough. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us," he said, his eyes flashing with anger. "We need to do something, to take action. But what could we do? We were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. We had been given a mission to hold this position at all costs, but now it seemed like a futile endeavor. The costs were too high, the rewards too low." Vargas shook his head, his expression grim. "We have our orders," he said, his voice firm but laced with doubt. "We have to hold this position no matter what. But why? Why were we being asked to sacrifice ourselves in this way? What was the point of it all?" I thought back to the briefings, to the words of the commanders. "This is a strategic location," they had said. "It's crucial to the war effort." But now, as I sat in the darkness, surrounded by the dying and the dead, I couldn't help but wonder if it was all just a lie. The realization crept in, slow and insidious. We were not going to be relieved. No one was coming to save us. We were on our own, abandoned to our fate. The thought was almost too much to bear, and I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. I looked around at the others and saw the same fear reflected in their eyes. We were a group of men, bound together by our shared experience, and now we were facing the very real possibility of our own mortality. And that was a prospect that was almost too terrible to contemplate. As the night wore on, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. We huddled together, our eyes fixed on the shadows, our minds racing with thoughts of what might be. The silence between us was no longer comfortable, no longer a sign of camaraderie. Now it was a sign of fear, of uncertainty. We were a group of men waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And when it did, we would be ready. We would face it together, as a team, as a family. But for now we just sat and waited, and wondered if we would ever see the light of day again. The darkness outside our makeshift perimeter seemed to seep into our veins, chilling us to the bone. Jenkins, usually the most stoic of us all, cracked first. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us," he whispered, his voice laced with a desperation that made my gut twist. "We need to fall back, regroup, and come up with a new plan." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel the weight of the others' gazes on me, waiting for my response. I glanced around at the faces of my squad, the men I'd come to trust with my life. There was Marcus, his eyes sunken, his skin pale, Rachel, her jaw set, her hand on the grip of her rifle, and Jackson, his brow furrowed, his eyes fixed on some point beyond our little circle. We were all thinking the same thing. We were being left to die, and we knew it. The relief column that was supposed to be our salvation was nothing more than a myth, a cruel joke played on us by the brass. "We have our orders," I reminded them, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're to hold this position no matter what." But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow. We'd been told that relief was on the way, that we just had to hold on for a few more hours. But those hours had turned into days, and the silence from command had grown thicker than the darkness around us. "That's just it, though," Jenkins said, his voice rising. "We're not just sitting ducks, we're trained soldiers. We can make a difference if we're given the chance." He looked around at the others, his eyes pleading. "We can't just give up, we have to try something." Rachel shook her head. "We've been over this, Jenkins. We can't fall back without orders. We have to hold this position." Her voice was firm, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We all knew that our situation was hopeless, that we were being asked to sacrifice ourselves for a cause that no longer seemed worth fighting for. Marcus spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's the point of holding this position anyway? We're not going to make a difference. We're just going to die one by one until there's no one left." His words were like a punch to the gut, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I knew he was right. We were being asked to throw our lives away, to sacrifice ourselves for a war that seemed to have no end. But I also knew that we couldn't just give up. We had to keep fighting, no matter how futile it seemed. We had to keep hoping, no matter how small that hope might be. "We'll hold this position," I said finally, my voice firm. "We'll follow our orders no matter what, because that's what we do. We're soldiers." The words felt like ash in my mouth, but I knew they were the right ones. We would hold this position together as a team. We would face whatever came our way, side by side, until the end. The others nodded slowly, and the argument seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant rumble of artillery, the creaking of trees in the wind. Then Jackson spoke up, his voice low and deadly. "We'll make them pay then. We'll make them pay for leaving us to die." His words were like a vow, a promise of vengeance that we would all carry with us into the darkness that lay ahead. Sergeant Thompson's voice cut through the tension, his words a reminder of our duty, of our orders. "We hold this position, no matter what. We've been told relief is on the way, and we'll give them a secure perimeter to work with." His eyes scanned us, one by one, as if daring us to contradict him. I felt a surge of loyalty towards him, towards the squad, and I knew I wasn't the only one. We'd been through too much together to turn on each other now. But the spark of hope that had driven us this far was flickering, guttering like a candle in the wind. We'd been promised relief, promised extraction, and yet it seemed like a distant memory, a fleeting dream. The Vox signal from command had been sparse, the words few and far between. Delayed was all they'd said. No explanation, no apology, just a cold, hard fact. We were on our own for now. I glanced around at the others, my squad, my brothers. Morales was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical, precise. Jenkins was checking the perimeter, his eyes scanning the trees, the bushes. Jackson was sitting on the ground, his back against a tree, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. We were all waiting for something, anything to happen. The silence between us was oppressive, heavy with unspoken thoughts. We'd all been thinking the same thing, wondering the same thing. Would they really come for us? Would they really try to extract us, or were we just being left to die? The questions swirled in my mind, like a maelstrom, pulling me down into the darkness. Thompson's voice cut through my thoughts, his words a reminder of our reality. We need to conserve our ammo, our water. We don't know how long we'll be here. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of fear. We were running out of time, running out of hope. I nodded slowly, and the others followed suit. We knew the drill, knew what we had to do. We'd been in tough spots before, but this was different. This was a war of attrition, a war of waiting, of hoping, and we were running out of hope, fast. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was a beautiful sight, a peaceful sight, but it was a lie. There was no peace here, only war, only death. And we were right in the middle of it, waiting for the inevitable. I stood up, my joints creaking, my muscles aching. We'd been sitting for too long, waiting for too long. I needed to move, needed to do something. "I'll go check the perimeter," I said, my voice low, my eyes locked onto Thompson's. He nodded, his face set in a grim mask. "Be careful," he said, his voice a warning. I nodded and set off, my rifle at the ready. The trees seemed to loom over me, casting long, ominous shadows on the ground. I felt like I was walking into a nightmare from which I might not awaken. But I had to keep moving, had to keep fighting. For the squad, for my brothers, I had to keep going. As I walked, the silence seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. I could feel the weight of our situation bearing down on me, crushing me. We were alone, truly alone, and we might never be found. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a cold, hard fear that I couldn't shake. I returned to the squad, my eyes scanning the trees, the bushes. We were still alone, still waiting, but for how long? Only time would tell, and time was running out, fast. The silence was a palpable thing, a living, breathing creature that wrapped itself around us, squeezing tight. I could feel its weight bearing down on me, crushing me, as I walked back to the squad. My eyes scanned the trees, the bushes, but there was nothing. No sign of the enemy, no sign of relief. Just us, alone, waiting. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a cold, hard fear that I couldn't shake. I glanced over at my brothers, at Victor, at Jensen, at Maria. They were all watching me, waiting for me to say something, to do something. But what? We were stuck in this limbo, this never-ending cycle of waiting and fighting and dying. Victor spoke up, his voice low and rough. "We need to keep moving, brother." "We can't stay here." I nodded, knowing he was right. We couldn't stay in one place for too long, not with the enemy closing in. But where could we go? We were surrounded, cut off from the rest of the world. Our options were limited, and dwindling by the minute. I thought back to the last Vox signal we'd received, the one that had promised relief by morning. But morning had come and gone, and we were still here, still alone. He was running low on ammo, and we all knew it. We were all running low on something. Ammo, water, hope. The thought was a bitter one, a hard, cold reality that we couldn't escape. We were expendable, nothing more than pawns in a much larger game, and pawns were meant to be sacrificed. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the present. We had to keep moving, had to keep fighting. For as long as we could, at least. "Let's move out," I said, my voice firm. "We need to find a new position, somewhere we can defend ourselves." Maria nodded, shouldering her pack. "I know a place," she said, "about a click from here. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." I nodded and we set off, moving quietly through the trees. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when the shooting started. It was a burst of fire, sudden and intense, and it came from our left flank. I hit the ground, rolling onto my stomach as I returned fire. The others were doing the same, laying down a withering field of fire that cut through the underbrush. But the enemy was relentless, pouring on the firepower as they tried to flank us. We were pinned down, unable to move, as the bullets whizzed overhead. I could feel the fear rising up, the panic that came with being outnumbered and outgunned. But I pushed it down, focusing on the fight. We had to hold our ground, had to keep the enemy from breaking through. I glanced over at Victor, who was firing his rifle in short, controlled bursts. He was a rock, a steady presence in the midst of chaos. And Jensen. Oh God! Jensen was a whirlwind, his rifle firing non-stop as he laid down a wall of lead. But despite our best efforts, The enemy was starting to push us back. They were too strong, too numerous, and we were running low on ammo. I could see the fear in Maria's eyes, the doubt that was starting to creep in. We were losing, and we all knew it. The thought was a hard one, a bitter pill to swallow. But I couldn't let it consume me, not yet. I had to keep fighting, had to keep hoping. For as long as I could, at least. I grabbed a grenade from my belt, pulling the pin as I waited for a lull in the firing. It came, a brief moment of silence, and I threw the grenade, watching as it arced through the air, exploding in a blast of flame and shrapnel. The enemy retreated, momentarily stunned, and we took advantage of the reprieve. We fell back, moving quickly as we tried to find some semblance of cover, but it was a temporary reprieve at best. The enemy would be back, and next time we might not be so lucky. I looked over at my brothers, at the fear and the doubt that was starting to creep in. We were running out of time, running out of hope, and I didn't know how much longer we could keep going. The thought was a hard one, a bitter reality that we couldn't escape. We were alone, truly alone, and we might never be found. The silence that followed was oppressive, a heavy, crushing weight that threatened to consume us all. The silence that followed was oppressive, a heavy, crushing weight that threatened to consume us all. I scanned the horizon, my eyes straining for any sign of movement, any indication that the enemy was regrouping for another attack. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of barren, dusty terrain stretching out before us like a graveyard. My throat was parched, my tongue feeling like sandpaper as I swallowed. I knew I wasn't the only one. The others were just as thirsty, just as exhausted. We'd been rationing our water for days, making it last as long as we could, but it was almost gone now. I thought back to the last time we'd had a decent drink, the last time we'd felt even remotely human. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Vex, our squad's medic, was tending to Jax's wounds, trying to stem the bleeding and stabilize him. I watched as he worked, his hands moving with a precision and calm that I could only admire. We were lucky to have him, lucky to have any of us, really. We'd been a team for so long, a family, and now we were all that was left. The thought sent a pang of sadness through me, a sense of loss that I couldn't shake. We'd lost so many already, good men and women, friends, and now it seemed like we were running out of time. I looked over at Kyle, our squad leader, his face set in a grim determination. He was trying to hold it together, trying to keep us all going, but I could see the strain in his eyes. He knew, just like the rest of us, that our situation was hopeless. We'd been abandoned, left to rot in this godforsaken place. The thought sparked a fury in me, a burning anger that threatened to consume me whole. How could they do this to us? How could they just leave us to die? The questions swirled in my mind, but I knew I'd never have the answers. As the sun beat down on us, relentless and unforgiving, I felt my own strength starting to wane. The heat was oppressive, a physical force that pressed down on us like a weight. I knew we couldn't stay here for much longer, not without water, not without shade. We had to keep moving, had to find some way to survive, no matter how slim the chances. But where could we go? The enemy was everywhere, surrounding us on all sides. We were trapped, caught in a killing zone with no escape. I glanced over at the others, seeing the same fear and doubt that I felt. We were a team, a squad, a family, and we were dying. Slowly, agonizingly. The thought sent a wave of despair through me, a sense of hopelessness that I couldn't shake. We'd been so sure, so confident that we'd be rescued, that we'd be reinforced. But now, it seemed like that was never going to happen. We were on our own, truly alone, and we might never be found. The realization was a bitter one, a hard, cold truth that we couldn't escape. As the sun began to set, casting the landscape in a bloody orange glow, I felt a sense of resignation wash over me. We'd made it through another day, but at what cost? We were weaker, thirstier, and more exhausted than ever. Our ammunition was running low, our water almost gone. We were a dying squad, a group of men on the brink of collapse. And yet we still held on, still clung to the hope that somehow, some way, we'd make it through this. But that hope was dwindling, disappearing with each passing minute, each passing hour. And when it was gone, I knew we'd be truly alone, left to face the darkness that was coming for us. The silence was deafening, a heavy blanket that suffocated us, making it hard to breathe. We'd grown accustomed to the constant crackle of the Vox system, the reassuring voice on the other end, promising relief, promising rescue. But now there was nothing, just static, just emptiness. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized the truth. Command had gone dark. We were alone, truly alone, for the first time since this nightmare began. The thought sent a chill through my veins, a creeping sense of dread that seeped into my bones. I looked around at the squad, at the men I'd come to consider brothers, and saw the same fear, the same desperation reflected back at me. Victor's eyes were sunken, his face gaunt, his skin pale. Jax's usual smirk was gone, replaced by a grim determination. And Marcus, poor Marcus, he just looked lost, like a child who'd wandered away from his parents and couldn't find his way back. I knew how he felt. We all did. We'd been abandoned, left to fend for ourselves in a war that seemed determined to consume us whole. The landscape around us was just as bleak, a barren wasteland of rock and dust, stretching out to the horizon like an open grave. The sun beat down on us, relentless, unforgiving, sucking the life out of us with every passing minute. Our canteens were almost empty, our water rationed down to tiny sips, barely enough to wet our parched lips. Ammunition was running low too, and I knew we couldn't hold out for much longer. We were a squad on the brink of collapse, a group of men clinging to each other, to the hope that somehow, some way, we'd make it through this. But that hope was fading fast, disappearing with each passing minute, each passing hour. I knew it, we all knew it. We'd been lied to, betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect us. The relief column that was supposed to save us, the extraction team that was supposed to pull us out, it was all just a myth. A fairy tale told to keep us compliant, to keep us fighting. And we'd fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. I remembered the first time we'd received the order to hold, the assurance that relief was on the way. We'd been so confident, so cocky, so sure that we'd be rescued, that we'd make it out alive. But that was a lifetime ago, a different era, a different war. Now we knew the truth. We were expendable, nothing more than pawns in a game we didn't understand, a game we couldn't win. The weight of that realization was crushing, a physical force that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of our own abandonment. We'd been left to die, left to rot in this God-forsaken place with no hope of rescue, no hope of escape. And yet, even in the face of that certainty, we held on, clinging to each other, to the only family we had left. Victor's voice cut through the silence, a low, rough growl that sent a shiver down my spine. "We need to keep moving," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the enemy. "We can't stay here, not for much longer." I nodded, knowing he was right. We had to keep moving, had to keep fighting, no matter how futile it seemed. It was the only way we'd survive, the only way we'd make it through this alive. But for how long? That was the question. How long could we keep this up before we succumbed to the inevitable? Before we fell one by one, until none of us were left? The thought sent a chill through me, a cold, hard fear that I knew would stay with me until the end. We fell back to the old bunker, the one we'd taken from the enemy weeks ago, its walls pockmarked with scars from countless battles. It was a sorry excuse for a defensive position, but it was all we had left. The squad moved with a sense of purpose, each man knowing what needed to be done, each one driven by a determination to survive, to make a last stand against an enemy that seemed to have no end. "All right, listen up," Sergeant Crail said, his voice low and even as we gathered around him. "We'll make our stand here. We'll barricade the doors, set up a perimeter, and make them come to us." His eyes locked onto mine, and I knew what he was thinking. This was it. This was the end. We'd fought for so long, for so hard, and now it was time to make our final stand. I looked around at the men, at the faces I'd come to know so well. There was Jax, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his eyes sunken with pain and exhaustion. There was Vic, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his jaw set in a determined line. And there was Sergeant Crail, his eyes burning with a fierce inner fire, a fire that seemed to be dwindling with each passing moment. We were all that was left, all that remained of a squad that had once been so full of life, so full of hope. Now we were just a handful of men, clinging to each other, clinging to the thought of making a last stand against an enemy that would not be defeated. The bunker was a mess, a jumble of broken furniture and shattered glass. We set to work, clearing a space, barricading the doors, and setting up a makeshift perimeter. It was a futile effort, perhaps, but it was all we had left. We worked in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, each one wondering how it had come to this. How had we been abandoned, left to die on this God-forsaken rock? The questions swirled in my mind, but I knew the answers. We were expendable, nothing more than pawns in a game we didn't understand. We were the arithmetic of war, the numbers that didn't add up. As we worked, the sun beat down on us, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of our hearts. It was a reminder that time was running out, that we had only hours, perhaps minutes, left to live. The thought sent a cold sweat trickling down my spine, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. We had to make this last stand count, had to make the enemy pay for every inch of ground they took. We owed it to ourselves, to each other, to make this last stand one to remember. The bunker's wall seemed to loom over us, a stark reminder of the fate that awaited us. We were trapped, caught in a desperate bid to survive, to make a last stand against an enemy that would show no mercy. But we would not go quietly into the night. We would rage against the dying of the light, and we would take as many of them with us as we could. That was the plan, the only plan we had left. We would sell our lives dearly, and we would make the enemy pay in full. I looked around at the men, and I knew that we were all thinking the same thing. This was it. This was the end. We'd fought for so long, for so hard, and now it was time to make our final stand. We'd been abandoned, left to die on this God-forsaken rock, but we would not go quietly into the night. We would make a last stand, a stand that would be remembered for eternity. And as I looked into the eyes of my comrades, I knew that we would do it together, as one, as a squad, as a family. We would make this last stand, and we would make it count. I looked around at the men, and I knew that we were all thinking the same thing. This was it. This was the end. We'd fought for so long, for so hard, and now it was time to make our final stand. We'd been abandoned, left to die on this God-forsaken rock, but we would not go quietly into the night. We would make a last stand, a stand that would be remembered for eternity. And as I looked into the eyes of my comrades, I knew that we would do it together, as one, as a squad, as a family. We would make this last stand, and we would make it count. Vexer, our heavy gunner, was already setting up his cannon, his eyes fixed on the approaching enemy lines. Aaron, our sniper, was scouting out the best vantage point, his rifle at the ready. Jax, our medic, was tending to the wounded, his face set in a grim determination. And Cale, our young recruit, was watching us all, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and adrenaline. I knew that he was thinking about his family, his friends, his life back home. But I also knew that he would stand with us, fight with us, and die with us if necessary. We talked about it, of course. We'd talked about trying to escape, about trying to make a break for it. But we knew it was futile. The enemy was too strong, too numerous. We'd be cut down before we even made it 100 meters. No, our only chance was to make a stand, to dig in and fight to the last man. And that's exactly what we would do. As I looked around at the makeshift defenses we'd set up, I felt a sense of pride. We'd done our best with what we had, and it would have to be enough. The barricades were sturdy, the trenches were deep, and the guns were ready. We'd made this place our own, our little fortress in the middle of nowhere, and we would defend it to the death. The enemy was getting closer, their artillery pounding our position relentlessly. We'd taken losses, of course. We'd lost good men, friends, brothers. But we'd kept fighting, kept pushing forward, and now it was all coming down to this, one final stand. One last chance to make a difference. I thought about the orders we'd received, the promises of relief that had never come. I thought about the VOP signal that had gone dark, the silence that had followed. And I thought about the arithmetic of war, the cold, hard calculations that had deemed us expendable. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the men around me. We were all that was left now. We were the last hope, the last stand, and we would not let each other down. We would fight, we would die, and we would do it together. The enemy would pay in full for every inch of ground they took, for every life they claimed. And when it was all over, when the dust had settled and the guns had fallen silent, we would be remembered. We would be remembered as the squad that refused to give up, that refused to back down. We would be remembered as the heroes of a war that had forgotten us. The enemy was at the gates now, their guns blazing, their screams echoing across the battlefield. We were ready. We were waiting. And when the time was right, we would unleash hell. We would sell our lives dearly, and we would take as many of them with us as possible. The time for hope was over. The time for courage was now, and we would not be found wanting.